Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Draft, and today we're going to go into the project file for Arara, a track which is out now on Mousetrap's We Are Friends Volume 5. So immediately off the bat, this is one of my smaller project files. There's not too much that went into the making of it. The mixer channels run up to 55. Some are buses, some are muted, some are not used. So it's a relatively small project. So the tune itself was built around a percussive drum loop, which it's also worth mentioning at this time, you'll see the correlation meter go a bit wayward throughout the project. Simply as the tune was an experiment to begin with, so I didn't focus too much on correcting issues. So this is the drum loop. There's quite a lot of processing on it. There's some effects that have been automated. There's an envelope on the delay, automation, on the pitch and the reverb. Just to provide edits and keep things interesting as the loop went on, so it didn't become too repetitive. So without the processing, the drum loop is pretty flat. Quite lifeless in that respect. The initial sample sounds like this. So what I'd done is I split it across three elements, created a very simple groove. One of the elements is reversed to help the flow of the loop itself. So in regards to the processing, the first plugin I've used is OTT. Usually I take the output gain down to -5 and -6 decibels just to keep the levels low, but I didn't here. There's some upward and downward compression on it. There's also a homicide distortion, which I used to drive the mid-range, not too much, but a fair bit, to give it a bit more punch and grit, essentially. There's the delay mod. And the mix and depth both 100, it's the delay that's being automated itself. There's a reverb which I pulled the dry and wet back quite a bit. There's also a parametric EQ, which I took a bit of the low end out of and boosted the frequencies where the attack transient of the drums hit. There's a Valhalla room. Usually I keep the bass multiplier down, but not in this instance. There's a multi-band compressor, mainly on the high end. And I've also used a compressor, quite harsh in that regards, a high ratio, and I boosted the gain as well to bring the levels up a bit more. Keep it contained as well so it doesn't change or damage it too much. And finally a parametric EQ where I've boosted the high end to give it a bit more clarity and a bit more brightness, and add a bit of vibrance. And the transient shaper where I've boosted the attack a bit and pulled back the release just to give it a bit more tightness in its delivery. And obviously in regards to the delay and reverb automations, they're most prominent at the end. I wanted to make the drums go from sounding percussive to straight chaos. And through the automation on the reverb and delay, it was the most effective way to do that. I also glitched up the main percussive loop which, when included with the main loop, it became too chaotic and kind of detracted away from the groove quite a bit, so I opted to not. Now underneath the main loop is another kind of chugging loop. It just adds a little bit more flow to the loop itself. It just keeps it a bit more interesting, really. So the kick drums, I usually like to keep my kick drums peaking at -4, between -4 and -6, and to have a bit of high end in them to help them sit in the mix. This is just one sort of punchy kick with a layered clap that had been lo-fi'd processed. The low end rolled out, the upper mids pulled back a bit, and the high end rolled off. It gave it an almost bit crush feel to an already distorted and lo-fi sounding clap. And that on top of the punchy kick and the low end with a bit of parallel compression gave it a bit more prominence in the mix. Now I also have a hat that is reversed that sort of sucks into each kick and holds for the attack transient, only for a few milliseconds. But I found that helped the kick cut through the track and the mix quite a bit, which helped nicely. I also realised pretty quickly that with the kick drums and the percussive loop that it needs something else just to keep a bit of engagement up. So I took 2 kick drums, rather than using 808s, which I would have used as toms or a tom replacement. I took 2 kick drums, panned them quite harshly against each other without the processing, and then with some OTT, mic band compression, EQ, reverb, a stereo enhancer, and the control on the transient shaper. I mean, you'll notice again the correlation meter going wayward, but if I stick it in mono, you'll see how I would have eventually pulled it up to have it sit correctly. But in regards to the correlation meter, when I was writing this tune, it wasn't something I was paying attention to. I didn't really bother too much about. But I just found they work very well with the kick and percussive elements when they're sort of feeding off each other to add a new dynamic to the sound. If I remove the sub now, you'll be able to hear it a bit more clearly. So there's a bit of additional percussion in the track. It's 7 instances, 7 different samples that I'm pretty meticulous when it comes to picking my percussion. So everything is in key together, everything sits nicely and works frequency-wise with each other. And most importantly, to the ear sounds nice, essentially. So I also have this switch, which is a percussive loop that, if I remove processing, sounds pretty flat, but with, fills up the spectrum pretty nicely. And it just adds a bit more of a dynamic to everything. So the percussion kind of just sits in the background. It's never meant to be too prominent. The levels were never meant to be pushed too hard. I just wanted it to sit nicely with the pan kicks and the kick drum itself to help create an additional groove. Now another part was the melody. I knew the track would get pretty boring if it was very repetitive, so I fired up an instance of Massive and threw in a very basic ARP melody. the B being the variation. In this instance of massive, it was based upon a pad that I created. Designed just to fill up the 400 to 800 area of the spectrum. Sit in the background, provides something different. If I take off the filter, it becomes a bit more obvious how the sound was created. If I take off the reverb as well, there's very little to no other processing going on. Essentially, it's a color wavetable, which when changed is awful. But with some reverb, a low pass filter and a bit of resonance on it, and some additional slight processing in regards to a parametric EQ, which boosted certain frequencies that I wanted to be a bit more present, a harsh compressor, another EQ where I've dipped a bit of the low mids out to give it a bit more width, and then the Valhalla room, which I've always found can give a bit more spatial dynamic width to a sound, kind of letting it seep out between the stereo mix. And the correlation meter again, gone wild. If I stick it in mono and pull it up a bit, you can kind of see where I'd usually having it sat. But again, in this instance of the tune, I wanted to keep it where it was. So the second part to the melody is an additional effect almost. I started creating a chaotic pad, but I try to use this sound in every tune that I make. Unprocessed. Pretty basic. You can see where it all stems from. It's essentially all this going on, but none of it's actually turned on. It's the noise with a slight LFO on the amplitude. The colour's all the way up to keep the pitch up. I mean, aside from that, there's very, very little actually being used to achieve that sound. It's just the processing behind it, where the EQ brings it out a bit, the compressor pumps it, another tidy up of an EQ, the delay, some reverb, and then finally a parametric EQ where I've just ducked out almost the upper mids, the mids to upper mids, just to give it a bit more width. And then together with the ARP, gives it an almost cosmic kind of feel. And then the final part of the melody was another instance of Massive, which I used to create a Vangelis style pad. Very simple, very basic. It's a low pass on pulse width modulator and a square saw wave. There's little to nothing else going on. There's a really big reverb and a delay. The reverb obviously elongating the sound out and making it a bit more epic, as it were. The voicing, I've got a unison of 4. There's a bit of pitch cut off, which I've got on a macro, which when increased, it sounds awful. However, when it's low, it gives a nice detune kind of bulk to the sound. The processing, I've got a parametric EQ that I've boosted certain frequencies. The second EQ literally takes out the mids, just give a bit more width. And the Valhalla room, again, just to add a nice tail onto the end of it. Obviously, again, the correlation meter was something I wasn't paying attention to. I do stress that you should really look at that quite often. Again, going from mono to stereo, you'll see the effect and the impact it has. Now all together. It just added a nice melody to have sat in the background. And then as the tune went on, I realized that I'd have to change the melody slightly, so I went up in the scale. And as the notes increase up in the scale, I've used the automation on delay and the reverb to create a sense of almost impending chaos without having to resort to huge risers or drum rolls or whatever else, you know. It's relatively subtle, but it gave the effect that I needed. So the switch up, as I call it, relatively simple, basic notes, nothing special. Both instances created in Absinthe. The first was my interpretation of Michael Jackson's Beat It intro. And the second was me listening to Stephan Bodzin, liking a saw synth and trying to recreate it. And simply looping it. So I've hard panned them, grouped them together. The bus literally has an OTT and a parametric EQ, nothing special at all. The individual channels have some EQ cleanups on them and a Valhalla room just to give them that sort of, that bit more space, that bit more prominence that they have. And with the sub, almost gives a warm, saturated kind of feel, which is what I wanted. Then all together, a very straightforward melody, didn't have to be anything dramatic. And just a couple of other things to look at. The first is a drone type of sound, again done in Absinthe. Very simple, very basic. Not too much done in regards to processing either. I mean, without, very flat and lifeless. The OTT has a slight downward compression on it, but the upwards is really driving it. There's a parametric EQ where I've taken out the lows and the mids to give it a bit more width. And again, the Valhalla room to give it that kind of siren alarm effect. And then the final kind of groove assisting technique that I threw in was again another sound created in Absinthe, which is sidechained against the kicks, not too dramatically. There's an EQ, which I've just tidied up certain areas, and against the kick drums, it just gives an added groove. It just kind of gives an added push and pull kind of feel against the kicks. It didn't have to be nothing too dramatic, it was just something to go alongside the percussion elements to give it a bit more of a dynamic